You know, I think St. Louis can be a pretty cool place to live, but there's some weird things to know about it. So in this video, I want to talk about 5 weird things to know about St. Louis, just as an area, some stuff we say and do here, so that you're not as shocked when you get here. And none of these I'm saying in a good or bad way. They're just some quirks to know about St. Louis. Every city's got them. You might think some are good, some are bad, but just some stuff to know that you might not expect when you're first coming here. Let's get right into it. Hey, my name is Jacob. Welcome back to the Living St. Louis channel. Number 1, you will hear this a lot with St. Louis, and that is the distinction between St. Louis City and St. Louis County. In general, there are a lot of different definitions of St. Louis if you say you're moving here or you live here, because some people might think you're talking about St. Louis City or St. Louis County, or you could be talking just about the general metropolitan area of St. Louis. But a big difference you want to know when it comes to living here, working here, just the way that things are, is there is a difference between the city and the county. I mean, sometimes it's like 2 completely separate worlds. They each have their own completely separate governments, police departments, fire districts, school systems. Taxes are different, and just the way people are can be different between the city and the county. The city has a 1% earnings tax if you live in the city or work there, so that's one thing to know. And one of the things to know about that is that St. Louis is what's called an independent city, where the city of St. Louis stands by itself, kind of separated from the other counties in the area. Now, the other city like that is Baltimore. Technically, there's also a smaller one in Nevada, and then there's a bunch in the state of Virginia. But that's one big thing to know, because if you are moving to St. Louis, you will want to think about if you're going to live in the city or the county. That can be a big decision, especially depending on where you're going to work or school or where you have friends and family. Anything that might influence where you want to live in St. Louis. They each have their own unique set of neighborhoods in the city, and then towns and municipalities in the county, which is more like the suburbs. You will meet a lot of very different people in each place, and they all have these little pockets and sub-communities within. And there's a bunch of different geographic divisions in St. Louis where things feel kind of separated, but the city and the county is probably one of the biggest ones. And don't get me wrong, it's not going to be a life or death decision if you're thinking between the city and the county, because at the end of the day, you're probably going to be hanging out in both parts of town. You might have friends who live in either one, depending on what part of town you're in. But just kind of thinking about it as far as what kind of lifestyle you want, what kind of neighborhood do you want to live in, what kind of house or townhome or apartment do you want to have when you come to St. Louis? Because within each one, you have a boatload of different choices. And hey, real quick, if you're moving to St. Louis, my team and I are a group of realtors. If you would like real estate help with that process, send us an email, send us a text, whatever works for you, no pressure, but that's what we're here for. All right, now moving on to number 2, and this goes for the state of Missouri, which is that the law is pretty lax about alcohol. Now, what you gotta know is that in St. Louis, the brewing industry is huge. It's massive. It plays a big role in the economy. So legislation is pretty lenient when it comes to alcohol. You can buy it, everywhere, like grocery stores, gas stations, any day of the week, pretty much 24/7 if the place is open, which I know that's not the case in every other state. Sometimes it can be hard to find, or they have like Sundays off. We don't have that here. Now, it gets tricky with some of these things because at the statewide level, some of these laws don't exist, but every town and city can have its own laws about open containers in cars, public intoxication, and drinking in public. But for the most part, Missouri is pretty lax. I'm not an attorney. This is not legal advice. This is just more of a fun thing to know. Now, it gets different the further out you go. So for example, in St. Charles, having an open container in the car is not legal. So you got to be careful depending on where you go. And there's all these exceptions and rules when it comes to drinking in public, being drunk in public, where it's okay, where it's not, and the circumstances. But as a general statement, the laws are pretty relaxed compared to other states that might be pretty strict. So if you're looking to live somewhere, you can get a drink pretty easily, and the law's pretty loose about drinking in public. St. Louis can give that to you. Now, moving on to number 3, speaking of driving. This is a few things combined into one, but basically, We have some weird driving habits here in St. Louis. The roads are weird and the way things are pronounced are weird if you're looking for directions and trying to make your way around town. So let's talk about when it comes to driving. Stop signs and red lights are sometimes kind of optional. You'll see people like slow down a little bit at a stop sign and then keep going, or run right through a red light where it was not a close call, like it was very clearly red. Driving like 10, 15 over the limit seems to be pretty common. Depending on where you go, like if you're in the city, it might be more like 5 to 10, but if you're like on the highway, limits 60 and like everyone's going 80, that's not uncommon. Now, hey, the good thing is, traffic really isn't that bad here. Now, I would say in St. Louis as a metro area, it's not as bad as what you might see in LA, Boston, New York. It's really not that bad. Now, don't get me wrong, during those peak rush hours in the morning going into the city and in the evening leaving the city, it does get backed up, and sometimes the highway is like a parking lot, but it's probably not gonna take you 2 hours to get home. And if the highway is backed up, there's usually a lot of side roads you can take. They're not gonna be faster, but you'll at least be moving. So I do that a lot. I don't care if it takes longer to get home. I will take a road that lets me move instead of being on the highway where it's stopped. Anytime there's traffic, it's really like just in a certain area, like it'll be a mile or two where it's pretty busy and then it kind of disappears. So any issue with traffic is not like an ongoing all hours of the day kind of thing. It gets bad around certain times, but for the most part isn't a big deal. Now, what you will also notice is that roads in St. Louis have different names. Interstate 64, also called Highway 40. Now, there's a bunch of streets where it starts off by one name and then switches to another name or two or three sometimes. So, for example, Lindbergh Boulevard turns into Kirkwood Road and Highway 67. Page Boulevard turns into Page Avenue, turns into Route 364. Highway 100 turns into Manchester Road, but they're separate for a little bit, and then turns into Manchester Avenue, and then turns into Choteau Ave. Olive Boulevard turns into Clarkson Road, turns into Kiefer Creek. Now, Interstate 270 goes north to south, but if you go far enough north or far enough south, it turns east to west. Now, those are just a few examples, but there's a bunch of streets where you'll notice it switches names at a stoplight, or it just has different names that people will call it. Now, let's talk about the way things are pronounced. As a general rule, anything that comes from French is probably not going to be pronounced the way you would expect. And that is because of Paw French, which was spoken by settlers back in the early days. It could be the name of a street, town, a neighborhood, a lot of different weird ways we say things. So I'll show you on the screen and then tell you how it's pronounced. We got Spady, we got Choteau, Gravois. I know, that one's a weird one. Kind of like Illinois, not Illinois. It's Gravois, not Gravois. This one's pronounced de Bolivar. And then there's some weird ones that are French and they are actually pronounced the way you would expect. For example, the town of De Pere and Sauget. Now, this one is more subtle and I get it wrong a lot knowingly just because I was raised saying it Lafayette. And it's a common name in other places, but a lot of times in St. Louis, you'll hear it called Lafayette. That one's a little more subtle, but that's just another example. Moral of the story, don't trust your GPS on some of these names. It'll say some weird stuff that's not French or English. And honestly, the list goes on. There are a lot of others, but those are just some of the big ones you might hear. And it's tough just because there's so many to list off and it depends on where you go and where you're living. But sometimes the way you say a road or a neighborhood will definitely flag you as a transplant or an outsider if you're talking to someone who is from here. Honestly, if you just want to ask someone how it's pronounced, they'll tell you. I mean, if someone's going to be obnoxious in correcting you, I mean, just kind of, all right, thanks, bye, have a nice day, and skedaddle on out of there. That's what I would do. And speaking of streets, there are some very wonky intersections you will find around St. Louis. This is a fun little map to show you some of the weird intersections that we have. I've been here for a decade, and with some of these, I still couldn't tell you. It's weird. I try to avoid going through any of these whenever possible. I don't know enough about the history of these to know what kind of urban planning led to these intersections, but it's nuts. Now, moving on to the fourth topic is a question everyone will ask you when they meet you. Where'd you go to high school? Now, I know that's not just a St. Louis thing. I know there's some other cities that also have this cultural phenomenon. but it is very common in St. Louis. I would say there's two sides to this. The first is that this is just very common and people ask you purely out of curiosity or habit because everyone does it. I think a lot of people are just used to that being one of the first questions you ask after you meet someone, like, hey, how are you? What's your name? Where'd you go to high school? Now, the other thing you'll hear is that sometimes this is a way of placing you and categorizing you based on where you live, what kind of person you are, socioeconomic class. Now, if you're not from St. Louis and you can't answer this question with a St. Louis high school, you'll kind of get out of that situation. But if you are from St. Louis and you have a St. Louis high school, you'll notice that there is sometimes this undertone of like, oh, okay, or oh, okay. Like someone's reaction to your answering the question can be very different depending on where you went to school and where they went to school and just where in St. Louis you're having this conversation. It'll be very different in a lot of places. If you're curious, I have this fun little map thanks to Reddit. If you're easily offended and you're from St. Louis, you probably shouldn't look at this. This is kind of a flow chart of just understanding people's answers to the high school question. So this is kind of like a version, I think, of like what's going on in their head. I think it's pretty funny. It's heavily based on stereotypes, so I will say that, but you know, it's a funny thing. That's just one of the quirks of St. Louis. Where'd you go to high school? You'll hear it a bunch. That's all I can really say about it. Now, number 5. The weather in general in St. Louis is pretty weird. It's all over the place. You might move here and have never had allergies a day in your life, and then St. Louis summer comes around, you might start getting sick, you might have some allergies you didn't know you had. And that's just kind of a combination of St. Louis weather, the humidity, I guess the plants that grow here, depending on where in St. Louis you are. But that is a common thing that we have heard from some of our clients moving here is, man, like I'm feeling congested. I'm feeling a little under the weather in the springtime or summer from someone who's never had that before. Very common. And, you know, just the weather in general is kind of an everyday roller coaster ride. In the wintertime, it might oscillate between -5 and 50. Sometimes we kind of have all 4 seasons in one day if it's in the spring or fall time. Really depends. St. Louis, like, you never know what you're going to get. It might start off 20 degrees in the morning and it might be 60 degrees later on that same afternoon. That's the Midwest. We don't have 4 seasons. We got like 10 different seasons in St. Louis. Anywho, 5 little quirks about St. Louis that might help you if you're moving here. I hope this gives you a better sense of what to expect if this is your first time coming to St. Louis or if you've been gone a while and you're making your way back. If I missed anything on this list, let me know in the comments, or if you moved to St. Louis and had a weird experience with any of these, let me know. Always very curious about how people navigate some of these situations. So thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video right here on the Living St. Louis channel. Take care.